Racist cop kicks black teen in the face for resisting, but he's FBI director's son. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of orange and purple that slowly faded into the night sky. The street lights buzzed to life one by one, casting a dim yellow glow across Maplewood Avenue. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood where children usually played during the day and families gathered on porches in the evening. Now it was calm, almost too calm, with only the distant sound of cars on the main road breaking the silence. Marcus Johnson walked steadily along the sidewalk, his gym bag slung over his shoulder and his hoodie pulled up to shield him from the cool evening breeze. He had just finished basketball practice at school, and his body still carried the tired but satisfying ache that came after hours of running drills, taking shots, and laughing with his teammates. Basketball was more than just a sport for Marcus. It was his dream, his escape, and his way of shaping a future that felt brighter than the present. With headphones in his ears, he bobbed his head gently to the rhythm of his favorite playlist. The beat carried him forward, keeping him in step, making the dark streets feel less lonely. He wasn't in a hurry, he had walked this path countless times, and the 10-minute stroll from the gym to his home was part of his routine. The houses were familiar, the trees leaning over the sidewalks were familiar, and the glow from living room windows was comforting. It was the kind of neighborhood where Marcus thought nothing unexpected would ever happen. But tonight would prove different. A slow, steady hum caught his attention through the music. He turned his head slightly, noticing headlights growing brighter behind him. A police cruiser rolled down the street, moving at the kind of careful speed that suggested the driver's attention was fixed on him. At first, Marcus thought nothing of it. Police cars passed through neighborhoods all the time. He kept walking, pretending not to notice, adjusting his bag strap and pulling his hood tighter against the breeze. The cruiser slowed even more, creeping closer until it was directly beside him. The tinted window rolled down halfway, and the deep voice of an officer cut through the quiet night. "Hey, you there? Stop a moment." Marcus's steps faltered. He pulled out his headphones, the music instantly silenced, and turned his head politely toward the voice. His heart ticked a little faster. He had seen videos online, heard stories from friends, and felt that familiar nervous energy whenever authority seemed to focus too heavily on him. Still, he reminded himself to stay calm. "Yes, sir," he asked, his voice steady but cautious. The officer's face was shadowed, but Marcus could see sharp eyes studying him closely. The cruiser's headlights washed over him, almost too bright, making him feel as if he were standing on a stage. "What are you doing out here?" the officer asked. Marcus shifted his gym bag higher on his shoulder. "Just walking home from practice," he replied. His voice carried no edge, only respect. He gestured to his school hoodie with the mascot logo, then to the basketball tucked into the side pocket of his bag. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, the car inched forward to block Marcus's path slightly, as though his answer wasn't enough. Another moment of silence passed, long enough for Marcus to hear the soft hum of his own nervous breath. "Mind if I ask for some ID?" the officer finally said. Marcus reached carefully into his pocket and pulled out his student ID card, the one with his picture in a red jersey and his school's name printed across the bottom. He held it up. The officer glanced at it quickly but didn't take it from him. "Marcus Johnson," the officer read aloud. 17. "Lives around here?" "Yes, sir." "Just 2 blocks down," Marcus said, pointing toward his street. He wanted to get home, where the warmth of his family's living room and the smell of his mother's cooking waited for him. The officer tilted his head, almost as if weighing Marcus's words. Then he stepped out of the cruiser, the door creaking open and shutting behind him with a thud. His boots tapped firmly against the pavement as he walked closer. He was taller up close, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of authority that seemed designed to make people uneasy. Marcus stood still, clutching his bag strap. He knew every move mattered. He remembered what his parents had told him since he was young: always be polite, never raise your voice, and keep your hands visible. You said you were at practice, the officer repeated, eyeing Marcus's gym clothes and sneakers. Late for practice, isn't it? Marcus shook his head. We stayed late today. Coach wanted us to work extra because we've got a game next week. The officer studied him for another long moment, as if waiting for something more. The street was empty, the only sound the faint chirp of crickets in the grass. Marcus felt as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Then, across the street, a curtain shifted in a house window. Someone was watching. Marcus's heart lifted just slightly, knowing he wasn't completely alone in this moment. The officer's radio crackled softly from his belt, breaking the silence. He glanced back at his cruiser, then returned his eyes to Marcus. All right, he said slowly, as if reluctant to release the tension. Head straight home. Don't wander. Yes, sir, Marcus said, relief rushing into his chest. He turned to continue down the sidewalk, his steps quickening. The weight of the moment clung to him, but the glow of his streetlights up ahead offered comfort. As he walked, he couldn't shake the thought that something about the officer's stare had felt heavier than usual, like it wasn't just about him walking home at night. He wondered if the officer saw more than a teenager in gym clothes, if he saw a challenge where none existed. Marcus didn't know, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. All he knew was that tonight, his ordinary walk home had been disrupted. And though it seemed the moment had passed, he didn't yet realize that this was only the beginning of a story much larger than himself. A story that would reach beyond Maplewood Avenue, beyond his school, and beyond his family's home, into places he never imagined his name would be spoken. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hospital corridor. Fluorescent lights flickered above, and the faint smell of antiseptic filled the air. Marcus lay on a stretcher being wheeled into an emergency room, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Nurses moved swiftly around him, checking his pulse, giving quiet instructions, and preparing medical instruments. The world around Marcus blurred, voices sounding distant, as if underwater. Outside the room, his mother, Angela Johnson, clutched her handbag tightly against her chest. Her eyes were wide with panic, her breathing uneven, and her hands trembled as she tried to make sense of the words the doctor had just spoken: he has a fractured jaw, and we need to run more tests. Her husband hadn't arrived yet, and she felt the crushing weight of being alone in that moment. She wanted answers, but none of the people in white coats gave her what she truly needed: why her son had been brought here in this condition. Neighbors who had seen what happened had already begun gathering in the hospital lobby. Some whispered in shock, others shook their heads with sadness, and a few filmed short clips for social media. Within minutes, videos of Marcus lying on the sidewalk, surrounded by flashing lights, began circulating online. The images spread quickly, accompanied by captions and hashtags that questioned the official story. Back at the scene, the police department had already released their first statement to the press. They claimed that Marcus had resisted, that the situation had escalated, and that the officer had acted within policy. The words sounded official, carefully chosen, and designed to shape public opinion before the truth could fully come out. But the witnesses' cell phone videos told a different story. They showed a teenager, unarmed and calm, confronted by an officer whose actions seemed unnecessary. The clips were short, shaky, and imperfect, but they carried a truth that no official report could erase. By the time Angela finally reached her son's hospital bed, her eyes filled with tears. She sat beside him, holding his hand gently, whispering words of comfort. Marcus's eyes fluttered open, heavy and weak. He tried to speak, but the pain in his jaw silenced him. Instead, he squeezed her hand, and that one gesture said more than words could. Outside the hospital, reporters were already gathering, microphones in hand, cameras flashing. They wanted statements, reactions, and sound bites. Some asked for the family. Others asked for the officer's name. The story was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Angela, exhausted, stepped into the hallway. A woman she recognized from the neighborhood approached her cautiously. "I saw everything," the neighbor said, her voice steady but emotional. "Marcus didn't do anything wrong. He was just walking home." Angela nodded slowly, her throat tight. She wanted to believe justice would come quickly, but she had lived long enough to know that wasn't always the case. Meanwhile, in living rooms across the city, families watched the news as the incident replayed. Some felt outrage, others disbelief, and many felt a familiar ache of recognition. For some, it was another reminder of how fragile safety could be. For others, it was proof of what they had long warned about, that sometimes the people meant to protect could be the ones who caused harm. By morning, Marcus's story was everywhere. On television, anchors spoke in serious tones about the incident. On social media, hashtags trended as thousands of strangers demanded accountability. In classrooms, students debated what had happened, and teachers struggled to focus on lessons. The entire community was caught in the storm of one night's events. At the same time, the police department doubled down on their statement. They emphasized words like procedure, resistance, and necessary. But their efforts clashed with the growing flood of video evidence. Ordinary citizens became reporters, sharing clips, screenshots, and testimonies. The truth was no longer contained in a single official statement, it was scattered across countless voices online. Angela refused to stay silent. She held a small press conference outside the hospital, her voice trembling but strong. "My son was walking home from practice," she said. "He is a good boy, a respectful boy. He did not deserve this. We will not stop until the truth comes out." Her words struck a chord, and within hours, community leaders reached out. Local pastors, activists, and lawyers all offered their support. Vigils were planned, rallies organized, and petitions launched. What had begun as a quiet night in one neighborhood was now becoming a national conversation. Inside his hospital room, Marcus listened to the voices of his parents and the hum of machines. He couldn't speak much, but his mind was awake, racing with questions. Why had this happened to him? Why had he been singled out? And most of all, how had a simple walk home turned into something so big? He didn't yet know that his story would travel far beyond his city. He didn't yet know that powerful people in high offices were already being briefed on what had happened. He didn't know that the world was about to learn his last name and the hidden weight it carried. As night fell again, candles flickered in front of the hospital. People gathered quietly, holding signs, praying together, and standing in solidarity. Some had known Marcus for years, watching him grow up on the basketball court. Others had never met him but felt connected to his story. Together, they stood as a reminder that this was no longer just about one teenager. It was about trust, truth, and the demand for fairness. And though Marcus rested in his hospital bed, still weak, the movement forming outside his window was growing stronger by the hour. Morning sunlight poured through the blinds of Marcus's hospital room, casting soft lines across the floor. The machines beside his bed beeped steadily, a rhythm that had become the background of his recovery. Marcus shifted slightly, wincing at the soreness in his jaw, but his mind was clear. He could hear his mother quietly speaking with the doctor outside, her voice carrying both worry and strength. The night before had felt unreal, like a dream that refused to fade. The crowd of people with candles, the flashing cameras outside the hospital, the endless buzz of phones, it was as though the whole world had suddenly tilted in his direction. And yet, he was just Marcus. Just a teenager who had wanted nothing more than to walk home after basketball practice. But the story was no longer just his. By noon, the hospital lobby was packed with reporters. Cameras pointed at every door, microphones stretched out for quotes, and news vans filled the parking lot. Headlines scrolled across television screens inside waiting rooms, teen injured in police encounter. Some channels played the shaky cell phone video on repeat, slowing it down, circling the figures, and replaying the officer's movements again and again. In living rooms across the country, families debated what they saw. Some shook their heads, saying it was a misunderstanding. Others raised their voices in frustration, saying it was proof of something deeper. But no one could deny the attention the story had gained. Then, quietly at first, a new piece of information began to spread. A journalist from a national newspaper had done some digging. She had connected the name on Marcus's student ID Johnson to a familiar figure in Washington. Within hours, whispers began to circulate on social media. Is Marcus related to FBI Director James Johnson? At first, people dismissed it as rumor. The idea seemed too far-fetched, almost impossible. But then another reporter confirmed it. Marcus Johnson was not just any teenager, he was the son of the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. News outlets scrambled to update their headlines. Teen in police case revealed as FBI director's son. Commentators filled the airwaves with questions. How could this have happened? How could the son of the man who oversaw the entire Bureau of Federal Investigations be caught in such a situation? Back at the hospital, Angela's phone buzzed non-stop. Friends, relatives, and strangers alike sent messages of support, but also questions she wasn't ready to answer. She looked at Marcus, still resting, and felt the weight of what this meant. It was no longer just about justice for her son, it was about a storm that had reached the highest levels of the nation's attention. When James Johnson, the FBI director, arrived at the hospital later that evening, the air in the lobby shifted. Cameras flashed wildly as he stepped out of a black SUV, flanked by staff. His presence drew whispers, gasps, and a rush of questions shouted into the air. But Director Johnson's face was unreadable, his posture tall and composed, even as his heart pounded with worry for his son. He moved swiftly through the crowd, ignoring reporters, and went straight to Marcus's room. The moment he entered, Angela rose and embraced him. For a second, the powerful figure was simply a father, holding his wife, looking at his son with eyes full of quiet pain. Marcus opened his eyes slowly and managed a faint smile. His father leaned closer, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I'm here," he whispered. It was all Marcus needed to hear. But outside the walls of the hospital room, the noise was only growing louder. Political leaders released careful statements, some calling for transparency, others urging calm. On talk shows, experts debated what this meant. If this can happen to the FBI director's son, one commentator said, what does that say about the system? The police department, caught off guard by the revelation, scrambled to respond. Their earlier statement suddenly felt flimsy against the backdrop of national attention. The officer involved was quietly placed on administrative leave, but that only fueled more anger. Protesters carried signs that read, "Justice for Marcus and no one is above the truth." At school, Marcus's classmates watched in disbelief. Some couldn't believe the quiet, basketball-loving kid they knew was now at the center of a nationwide story. Teachers tried to carry on with lessons, but students whispered about the videos, the news, and the powerful father now connected to it all. Back in Washington, meetings buzzed behind closed doors. High-ranking officials debated how the Bureau should handle the situation. Some warned that Director Johnson's personal involvement could raise questions of conflict. Others argued that the case demanded federal oversight precisely because of its importance. Through it all, Marcus remained at the center, though he never asked for it. He lay in his hospital bed, surrounded by flowers, cards, and messages from strangers across the country. Some letters encouraged him to stay strong, others thanked him for bringing attention to something bigger than himself. Late one evening, Marcus looked at his mother and father, both seated beside him, their faces tired but determined. His voice was weak, but he spoke clearly enough. "Why me?" Angela reached for his hand. "Because sometimes life chooses people, Marcus. Not because they want it, but because they're strong enough to carry it." James Johnson, usually careful with his words, nodded. "You're not alone in this. And this time, the world is watching." Outside, the crowd of supporters grew larger, holding signs and chanting softly in the night air. The hospital had become more than a place of healing, it had become the center of a movement. And as the nation wrestled with the shocking truth, Marcus's story transformed from a local incident into a symbol. A symbol that even the son of the FBI director could face the same struggles as any other teenager. A symbol that truth, once uncovered, could not be silenced. The revelation had changed everything. What began as a single encounter on a quiet street was now a question echoing through the halls of power. What would happen next? The days after the revelation felt like a storm that would not end. News trucks lined the street outside the hospital. Protesters carried handmade signs and candles, their voices blending into a steady chorus of chants that echoed late into the night. Every corner of the city seemed to buzz with one name: Marcus Johnson. Inside the hospital, Marcus was slowly recovering. His jaw was still tender, and he spoke only when necessary, but his mind remained sharp. He scrolled through his phone, reading messages of support from classmates, teachers, and even strangers from faraway places. Thousands of people he had never met were now calling him brave, strong, and a symbol of change. He never imagined that a simple walk home would lead to this. Meanwhile, his father, director James Johnson, was facing the hardest choice of his career. He had built his reputation on professionalism, staying above politics, and never allowing personal matters to cloud his judgment. But now the personal and the professional had collided in a way he could not ignore. His son was the one in that hospital bed, and the world knew it. In Washington, the FBI's headquarters buzzed with activity. Senior officials gathered in conference rooms, their voices tense. A decision had been made: the Bureau would launch an independent review of the case. Agents were sent to the city to collect evidence, including the officer's body camera footage and witness statements. The department could no longer rely on its own explanations, federal eyes would be watching every detail. When news of the FBI's involvement broke, the reaction was immediate. Some celebrated, believing it meant real accountability was coming. Others doubted, worrying that the system would protect its own. But one thing was clear: this was no longer just a local issue, it had become a national investigation. On the third night after the incident, a crowd of nearly 2,000 people gathered downtown for a peaceful rally. Families carried candles, young people held up their phones with messages of solidarity, and community leaders spoke from a small stage. They called for fairness, transparency, and respect. Marcus's classmates stood together, wearing their team jerseys as a sign of unity. From the stage, one speaker said, "We stand here not just for Marcus, but for every young person who deserves to walk home without fear." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in agreement. Back at the police department, the pressure mounted. Officer Daniels, the man at the center of the storm, had been placed on leave. The department's leaders faced tough questions from reporters: why had their first statement contradicted the videos? Why had it taken so long to act? The chief's answers were careful, but the frustration in the community only grew stronger. Inside the Johnson household, the atmosphere was heavy with both love and tension. Angela stayed by Marcus's side most of the day, reading him messages and keeping him company. Director Johnson spent long hours on the phone, balancing his role as father and as one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. Finally, on the fifth day, James Johnson made a choice he had never expected to make. He would speak publicly not as the head of the FBI, but as a father. That evening, he stood at a podium outside the hospital, surrounded by microphones and flashing cameras. His wife stood beside him, holding his hand, and Marcus watched from his hospital window above. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. "My family has always believed in service, in justice, and in fairness," he said, his voice steady. "But today, I am not only a public servant. I am a father. And as a father, I have seen my son suffer in a way no parent should have to witness. This is not just about Marcus. This is about ensuring that truth is respected and that every young person in this country feels safe." The silence that followed his words was powerful. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked, and the crowd held its breath. For the first time, the director of the FBI had broken his silence not to defend the system, but to call for accountability within it. The next morning, his speech was replayed on every major news channel. Analysts debated its meaning, politicians quoted it, and citizens across the country shared it online. To many, it was a turning point, a moment when authority acknowledged the pain of ordinary families. But not everyone welcomed it. Some critics argued that Johnson was using his position to push a personal agenda. Others claimed it showed weakness in leadership. Yet for Marcus, it meant everything to know that his father had chosen to stand with him not just privately, but before the world. As the investigation moved forward, federal agents met with witnesses who had recorded the scene on their phones. They collected statements from neighbors who had seen Marcus walking home peacefully. They analyzed the officer's body camera footage, comparing it against the official police report. Every detail was scrutinized, every word examined. The community waited anxiously. Each day brought new headlines, new debates, and new demonstrations. But beneath the noise, something else was happening. People were beginning to unite. Neighbors who rarely spoke before now marched together. Teachers, parents, and students held meetings in schools and community centers, discussing not only Marcus's case but also how to build trust and fairness moving forward. Marcus, though still weak, felt the change from his hospital room. He watched videos of rallies, read articles about his father's speech, and saw how strangers were standing up on his behalf. It was overwhelming, but also inspiring. "This is bigger than me," he whispered one evening to his mother. Angela smiled softly, brushing his hair from his forehead. "Yes, it is. But it started with you, and that means something." By the end of the week, the story had reached international news outlets. Headlines in other countries spoke of the teen at the center of America's debate. Foreign leaders even commented, some praising the courage of Marcus's family, others using it as a lesson for their own nations. The pressure on the justice system was immense. The officer's case was moving toward trial, and the nation prepared for what would come next. For Marcus, life had changed forever. He could no longer walk into school as just another student. He could no longer play basketball without people recognizing his name. But as he lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by his family's love and the world's attention, he began to understand something important. Sometimes life puts a person in the center of a story not because they ask for it, but because they are meant to spark change. And though the hardest days were still ahead, Marcus knew one thing for certain: he was no longer walking alone. The courthouse steps were crowded with people on the first day of the trial. Reporters filled the sidewalks, their microphones ready, while supporters carried signs with messages of hope and fairness. Some wore shirts with Marcus's name, while others held candles in silent unity. The air was tense but filled with determination. Everyone knew this case was more than a courtroom battle. It was a test of trust, a question of whether truth would truly matter. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even heavier. Wooden benches creaked as people filled every seat. Marcus sat quietly beside his parents, his posture straight, his face calm but serious. He had healed enough to attend, though the memories of that night still echoed in his mind. His father rested a steady hand on his shoulder, while his mother whispered words of encouragement. At the front of the room, the officer, now stripped of his badge, sat with his legal team. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed forward. The judge entered, and everyone rose to their feet. The trial had begun. Over the next several days, the courtroom became a stage where two very different stories collided. The officer's lawyers argued that he had followed procedure, that he believed Marcus's actions were suspicious. They painted a picture of confusion and urgency, hoping to convince the jury that mistakes had been made but not wrongdoing. But the prosecution presented a clearer picture. Witnesses took the stand: neighbors, classmates, and even strangers who had seen the incident. They described Marcus's calm walk home, the sudden confrontation, and the officer's unnecessary response. Cell phone videos were shown on large screens, their shaky frames capturing more truth than any written report. And then came the body camera footage, which matched what the witnesses had described, not the officer's initial claims. The jury watched closely. The courtroom listened in silence. Each detail added to the weight of the truth. Marcus, though not called to testify, felt every word deeply. He remembered the faces of his neighbors who had stepped forward to speak for him. He remembered the quiet strength of his classmates who had come to court, sitting behind him in rows of support. It gave him courage to face each long day of the trial. Outside the courthouse, crowds grew larger. People held rallies, sang songs, and spoke about change. Journalists reported not only on the trial but also on the bigger meaning behind it. "This is about more than one young man," one anchor said on live television. "This is about whether fairness is real for everyone." Finally, after weeks of arguments, cross-examinations, and evidence, the case reached its end. The jury left the courtroom to deliberate. Hours passed, then more hours. The city held its breath. People gathered in front of the courthouse, waiting for the decision. Marcus sat with his parents, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes closed in silent prayer. When the jury returned, the room went silent. The foreperson stood, holding the slip of paper with the verdict. The words were read aloud: "Guilty of misconduct, guilty of unnecessary force." A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Some gasped, others cried, and many simply bowed their heads in relief. For Marcus, it felt like the heavy weight he had been carrying since that night had finally begun to lift. His mother wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. His father closed his eyes and took a long, steady breath, his grip on Marcus's shoulder firm. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. Candles were raised, signs were waved, and voices shouted in joy. For once, it felt as if justice had been served. In the days that followed, the verdict was celebrated across the country. Newspapers ran headlines about the rare moment of accountability. Talk shows replayed clips of the trial, and communities everywhere held discussions about what it meant. Some saw it as a turning point, while others reminded that much work still needed to be done. For Marcus, life slowly began to move forward. His jaw healed, and though the memory of that night would never fully fade, he returned to school surrounded by support. His teammates welcomed him back to the basketball court, clapping him on the back, reminding him that he was still the same Marcus who loved the game. Stepping onto the court again for the first time felt like reclaiming a part of himself that had been taken away. But Marcus was no longer just a teenager from Maplewood Avenue. He had become a symbol, a reminder that even those with powerful families were not shielded from difficult truths. Letters continued to arrive at his house, not only from across the nation but from other countries as well. People thanked him for inspiring them, for reminding them that change was possible. One evening, as the family sat together at their dinner table, Marcus looked at his father. "I didn't want any of this," he said softly. James Johnson nodded. "I know, son. But sometimes we don't choose the story. The story chooses us. And what matters is what we do with it." Angela smiled gently. "And you've handled it with courage, Marcus. That's what people see. That's why they believe in you." Marcus thought about that as he ate quietly, the warmth of his family around him. Perhaps he hadn't chosen to be the center of attention, but he had chosen how to face it with dignity, patience, and strength. Months later, when he stood at a community event where leaders gathered to talk about fairness and safety, Marcus was invited to speak. His voice, once shaky, now carried confidence. "I'm just a young man who wanted to walk home one night," he began. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone. But I stand here today not because of what happened, but because people stood with me. Together, we showed that truth matters. And together, we can keep moving forward." The crowd applauded, their faces glowing with pride. In that moment, Marcus realized that his story had become part of something bigger. It was no longer just about pain or struggle, it was about hope, unity, and the belief that tomorrow could be better. As the evening sky turned golden, Marcus looked out at the people gathered, their candles lighting the dusk. He took a deep breath, feeling both humbled and strong. His journey had been difficult, but it had taught him something valuable. Even in the darkest nights, light could be found, and even in the hardest moments, change could begin. And so, the story that started with a simple walk home ended with a community united, a family strengthened, and a young man who discovered his voice not only for himself but for many others.